I came home from work, like I always do, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. My routine is pretty simple: clock out, drive back, and find my wife at home, taking care of things. That's how we've always operated. But that day was different. As soon as I walked through the door, I heard her voice, loud and animated, along with the familiar chatter of her friends. It wasn't the usual soft background murmur of a casual conversation, they were really going at it. Something was clearly the center of attention. Kicking off my shoes and washing my hands, I followed the noise into the living room. They were all huddled together on the couch, laughing and talking over each other, almost like kids gossiping at recess. I'm not one to intrude, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a mug of coffee, took a seat in my usual armchair, and decided to tune in. Sometimes, their chatter was more entertaining than the action movies I'd usually zone out to after work. From what I gathered, they were reminiscing about their younger days, wild parties, spontaneous road trips, and carefree nights that seem a world away now. One of them, probably inspired by nostalgia, suggested they recreate one of those nights. My wife and the others jumped on board with the idea, tossing around possibilities for a casual gathering, maybe at someone's house or even out at a local bar. It sounded harmless enough. I kept sipping my coffee, silently amused by how much energy they were putting into the idea. Then, one of the women, my wife's friend, Lena, took the conversation in a completely unexpected direction. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "What if we made it special?" she said. At first, no one seemed to catch on to what she meant. She clarified, smiling as though she'd just cracked a joke. "You know, like a swinger party." I nearly choked on my coffee. The room went quiet for a split second before erupting in laughter. My wife and her friends looked at each other, wide-eyed and giggling like teenagers. Lena went on, explaining her idea as if it was the most natural suggestion in the world. She reassured everyone that it didn't have to be anything extreme, people could stick with their own partners if they wanted to. "It's just a thought," she said, shrugging. "Something fun, something different." The way she pitched it, you'd think she was suggesting a themed dinner party. The others laughed and joked about it, throwing around playful what-ifs. Someone suggested it might be less awkward to start with a simple bar outing instead of diving straight into something so unconventional. That seemed to ease the tension in the room. No one outright dismissed Lena's idea, but they weren't exactly jumping at the chance to plan it either. My wife, ever the diplomat, suggested they table the idea for now. "Let's just plan a regular girls' night first," she said, and the others nodded in agreement. They started throwing out names of local bars, debating which one had the best atmosphere, while I sat back, quietly taking it all in. To me, it was like watching an unscripted sitcom unfold right in my living room. By the time they were wrapping up the conversation, everyone seemed to be in a good mood. The room was filled with laughter and a sense of camaraderie. It was clear they had no immediate plans to take Lena's suggestion seriously, which was a relief. For now, the focus was on something more grounded, a night out where they could let loose and enjoy each other's company. And as far as I was concerned, that was as far as it needed to go. After everyone left, we headed straight to bed. I was exhausted from work, and with a day off coming up, I wanted nothing more than a good night's sleep. The house had finally quieted down, and I could feel the weight of the day pressing down on me. It didn't take long for me to settle into the mattress and start drifting off. But, of course, just as I was slipping into sleep, my wife nudged me awake. "Hey, can I ask you something?" she said, her voice cutting through the haze of my half-asleep state. I opened one eye, trying to focus. "What now?" I grumbled, not entirely thrilled about being pulled back into consciousness. She ignored my tone, clearly intent on whatever was on her mind. "What do you think about what Lena said?" she asked. It took me a moment to process. Lena's suggestion earlier in the evening flashed through my mind, the swinger party idea. My first instinct was to dismiss it outright, but I decided to at least hear her out. "I'll be honest," I said after a pause. "I'm not exactly on board with the whole partner swapping thing. It's just not my thing. If it's just us two, maybe I could consider it, but beyond that?" I shook my head. "Not really my speed." She was quiet for a moment, and I thought the conversation might be over. But then she spoke again. "Doesn't it bother you, though? You know, the idea of being around other people in that situation?" she asked, her tone genuinely curious rather than accusatory. I couldn't help but laugh. "Are you serious?" I said. "The guys in the locker room have seen me naked more times than you have. I don't think there's much left to be self-conscious about." She rolled her eyes at that, but I saw the corner of her mouth twitch into a reluctant smile. "You're impossible," she muttered, turning onto her side. She didn't press the issue any further, which was a relief. The last thing I wanted was to spend my night off getting into a debate about something I wasn't even remotely interested in. As she settled into her pillow, she gave a soft sigh and said, almost as an afterthought, "Well, good night. I'll let it go for now." Her voice carried a hint of amusement, but nothing more. "Good night," I replied, closing my eyes and hoping this would be the last interruption. Within moments, I heard her breathing slow, and she drifted off. For now, the topic was done, and I could finally relax. The next morning, over breakfast, my wife dropped a bombshell. "I've been thinking," she said, stirring her coffee. "Maybe I should organize that thing Lena mentioned. You know, the party." I put down my fork, eyeing her carefully. It wasn't unusual for her to get excited about new ideas, but this one caught me off guard. Before I could respond, she added, "I'm meeting Lena today to talk it over." "Lena and her boyfriend will be there too," she continued, as if that was supposed to reassure me. Instead, it set off alarm bells. The idea of involving someone like Lena's boyfriend, a guy I'd only heard stories about, made me uneasy. My wife must have noticed my expression because she quickly added, "Don't worry, I'll keep you updated. But you'll probably want to check things out yourself, knowing you." "Damn right I will," I muttered, pushing my plate away. It wasn't just the involvement of strangers that bothered me. The prospect of hosting such an event in our home was a hard no in my book. Rule number 1 of parties: never throw them in your own house unless you're ready to deal with the aftermath. And this wasn't just any party. By the time she left, I was already running through a mental checklist of things I'd need to keep an eye on if this ridiculous idea moved forward. Hours later, she came back, looking a little flushed, and not just from excitement. The faint smell of wine told me she'd been drinking. "It's coming together," she said, dropping her purse on the counter. "But it'll take more time to plan everything properly." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to elaborate. "Lena's boyfriend is on board," she added with a grin. "And get this, he owns a sex shop. He said he could hook us up with, you know, supplies." That last word hung in the air, and I couldn't help but chuckle at how casually she said it, as if she was talking about party streamers and balloons. She went on to share some of the good news from her meeting. Apparently, Lena's boyfriend had shown them some of the products he carried. "He even brought out these giant toys," she said, laughing. "I don't know who buys those things, but they're hilarious. We should get one just for the joke of it." The thought of it was so absurd that I couldn't help but laugh along with her. "Yeah, sure," I said, shaking my head. "But I'll tell you right now, if you do, it's only ever going to see the inside of a closet." That set her off into another fit of laughter, and for a moment, the tension around the whole idea eased. A few days later, my wife approached me with another idea. "We need to have a barbecue," she said, as if it were the most logical solution to all our problems. I raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to elaborate. "We can invite everyone over and finalize the party plans," she explained. "Lena and I have been talking, and this is the best way to get everyone on board." I couldn't help but feel a little skeptical. It's not like we hadn't had opportunities to gather people before. You've been running around with this idea for days now, I said. Why not just organize it already? Do we really need a whole barbecue for this? She smiled, brushing off my comment. It's our first time doing something like this. I want it to be perfect. Reluctantly, I agreed. I dusted off the grill, made a trip to the butcher for some quality cuts, and spent the afternoon setting up in the backyard. By the time the guests started arriving, everything was in place. As people settled in, I noticed Lena's boyfriend for the first time. He was hard to miss, with tattoos covering his arms and piercings in places I didn't even know could be pierced. There was something about his eyes, wild, almost predatory, that put me on edge. For the most part, the barbecue went off without a hitch. People mingled, joked around, and enjoyed the food. But it didn't take long for me to notice something odd about Lena's boyfriend. While everyone else was mingling as a group, he seemed to focus solely on the women. He'd move from one to the next, leaning in close, talking and laughing in a way that felt off. I decided to ask Lena about it. Doesn't it bother you how he's acting? I asked. She shrugged. I'm not the jealous type, she said casually. He's just being friendly. If you say so, I replied, not entirely convinced. As I walked away, I spotted my wife deep in conversation with him. They were laughing about something, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of irritation. I walked over, catching the tail end of their conversation. They were joking about the oversized toys Lena's boyfriend had shown them earlier. Can you even imagine? My wife said, laughing. Not wanting to make a scene, I stepped in and redirected the conversation. It was subtle, but I could tell from the look on his face that he wasn't happy about the interruption. He didn't stick around much longer after that, which was fine by me. Later, after everyone had eaten, my wife stood up and made an announcement. She explained her plans for the party, laying out the concept for everyone. It's up to you what you want to do, she said. Stay with your partner, or don't. Invite friends if you want. The point is to have fun. Most of the group seemed open to the idea. Our house was big enough to accommodate everyone, and the prospect of a unique evening intrigued them. But as I stood there, listening to the chatter and seeing the enthusiasm build, I couldn't shake my unease. Hosting this in our home still felt wrong. It wasn't just about the logistics or the cleanup, it was the principle of it. Still, I kept my thoughts to myself. The wheels were already in motion, and there was no turning back now. After everyone left that evening, the house finally settled into silence. I cleaned up the last of the dishes while my wife lingered in the living room, scrolling through her phone. As I dried my hands, the thoughts that had been swirling in my mind since the barbecue finally spilled out. You know, I began, leaning against the counter, I don't see how Lena's relationship is going to last. Did you notice how her boyfriend was acting? He wasn't just chatting with the other women, he was outright flirting. And with you too. My wife looked up, surprised. What are you talking about? She asked, setting her phone down. He's just friendly. I shook my head. Friendly? Come on. The way he zeroed in on you, laughing and joking like that. He's testing boundaries, and if Lena doesn't see it, she's blind. But you saw it, didn't you? She hesitated, then sighed. I guess I can see how it might come across that way, but it's not my place to say anything. Besides, Lena's happy. She's not looking for something serious with him. Her casual dismissal only irritated me further. Not serious? I said. How can she put up with a guy who's openly making moves on other women? And what about you? Doesn't it bother you that he was coming on to you? Relax, she said, brushing off my concerns. It's not what you think. Lena's in it for the benefits. She told me herself, she's only with him because of the sex and the money from his store. That's all she wants. I stared at her, stunned by the bluntness of her explanation. You're serious? I asked. That's what she said. My wife nodded. She's a fan of open relationships, and apparently, he's on the same page. It works for them. I couldn't wrap my head around it. That's not a relationship. That's a transaction, I said, shaking my head. And you're just okay with this? She shrugged. It's their business, not ours. They're both adults, and they've made their choices. Who are we to judge? I'll tell you who I am, I replied. I'm the guy who has to sit here and watch this circus unfold. If Lena wants to play games with her life, fine. But I don't want her mess spilling over into ours. And I definitely don't want her boyfriend hanging around here if he's going to act like that. My wife sighed, clearly tired of the conversation. Look, I get it. You don't like him. But this isn't about us. Lena knows what she's doing, and she's happy. Let's just focus on our own lives, okay? It was hard to argue with that, even if I didn't entirely agree. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Lena might think she had things under control, but her boyfriend's behavior said otherwise. I didn't trust him, and I didn't like the idea of him being around my wife. But for now, I let it go. There was no point in pushing the issue any further tonight. As the conversation wound down, my wife glanced at the clock. We've got an early start tomorrow, she said, standing up and stretching. I've got a couple of errands to run in the city, and I want to get them out of the way first thing. I nodded, grateful for the excuse to shift gears. There would be plenty of time to revisit this discussion later, but for now, it was time to get some rest. The next morning, I couldn't shake the unease from the previous night's conversation. Over breakfast, I watched my wife bustling around, grabbing her bag and checking her phone. Something was clearly on her mind. Where are you off to? I asked casually, trying to keep my tone neutral. She glanced at me, already halfway to the door. Oh, Lena's feeling under the weather, too much cold beer, probably. I'm going to meet her boyfriend to pick up some supplies for the party. That stopped me in my tracks. You're going with him? I said, trying to hide my irritation. She nodded, her hand on the doorknob. Yeah, he's giving us a bunch of stuff for free, so it'll save us some money. Plus, he's got some interesting things we might even want to try ourselves, she added with a wink. I opened my mouth to protest, but before I could get a word out, she was out the door, calling back, "Don't worry, I'll be back soon." The door clicked shut, leaving me standing there, frustration bubbling under the surface. The idea of her spending time alone with that guy didn't sit right with me, but she was already gone. There wasn't much I could do about it now. I sank onto the couch, pulling out my phone in an attempt to distract myself. As I scrolled through messages, I noticed a group chat with my friends lighting up. Curious, I opened it and found them discussing the very same guy who was now off with my wife. Anyone else notice how that Lena's boyfriend acts around women? One of them wrote. He's way too friendly for my liking. Another chimed in. You're not imagining it. I caught him flirting with my wife at the barbecue. She told me he even messaged her afterward. I shut that down real quick. My stomach tightened as I read their comments. It wasn't just me who had noticed his behavior. Clearly, this guy had a pattern, and it wasn't harmless. The conversation continued, with more of my friends sharing similar observations. One mentioned how he'd seen the guy trying to isolate women during gatherings, always finding excuses to talk to them one-on-one. Another said his wife had described him as charming but creepy, which seemed to be a common theme. It was becoming increasingly clear that this wasn't just a personality quirk, it was deliberate. What really set me on edge was when one of the guys shared something even more alarming. I caught my wife texting him, he admitted. Nothing too bad, but it was enough for me to put a stop to it. I told her he's off limits. That hit close to home. The thought of my wife being anywhere near this guy, let alone with him, made my blood boil. I put my phone down, unable to focus on anything else. It wasn't just about jealousy or insecurity. This guy was a problem, and it wasn't just my imagination. If he was bold enough to make moves on other men's wives, who's to say he wouldn't try something with mine? The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I needed to address this before it escalated. By the time my wife got home, I already knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to let this slide any longer. That guy needed to be kept away from her, and I was going to make sure of it. Whatever it took, I wasn't about to let him jeopardize my marriage or my peace of mind. That evening, my wife walked through the door carrying a massive box of condoms. I stared at her, dumbfounded, as she plopped it down on the kitchen table with a satisfied grin. Right behind her was Lena's boyfriend, carrying another smaller bag. He gave me a casual nod as he set it down. "Just thought I'd help out," he said with a smirk before turning back to my wife. "Let me know if you need anything else." I watched him closely as he lingered for a moment longer than necessary. He finally turned to me, flashing a smile. "Nice to see you again," he said, and with that, he was out the door. I didn't respond, barely resisting the urge to slam the door behind him. My wife seemed oblivious to my frustration as she started unpacking the box, humming to herself. "Close the door," I said firmly. She stopped mid-motion, looking at me with a mix of surprise and confusion. "What?" she asked. "Close the door," I repeated. "We need to talk." Her expression shifted to one of annoyance, but she complied, shutting the door and crossing her arms. "What's this about?" she asked. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my tone steady. "It's about him," I said, nodding toward the door. "I've been watching him, and I'm not the only one who's noticed his behavior. He's not just a little too friendly, he's outright inappropriate. One of my friends caught his wife texting him. He's not someone I trust, and I don't think you should either." Her brow furrowed, and she shook her head. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she said. "He's just helping with the party. That's all." I wasn't having it. "Helping?" I scoffed. "He's crossing lines left and right, and it's not just me who sees it. I'm making the call now, no more private interactions with him. If you need something from him, it goes through Lena, or she's there when it happens. Period." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice rising. "He's been a huge help with this party, and you're trying to ruin everything. Do you even hear yourself? You sound like a control freak." I didn't back down. "Call it what you want," I said. "But if you think I'm going to sit back while that guy hovers around you, you're wrong. And if you really think I'm overreacting, let me put it this way, either you cut off the private interactions, or my friends and I will handle it another way. And trust me, you won't like how that ends." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You're being ridiculous," she finally said. "This is just about your ego." I crossed my arms, holding my ground. "Think what you want," I said. "But this is the best solution for everyone. You're almost done with the party planning anyway. It's not like cutting him off will ruin everything." She sighed heavily, clearly frustrated, but I could see the gears turning in her head. After a long pause, she finally said, "Fine. I'll do it your way. But you're making this way harder than it needs to be." I nodded, satisfied. "Good. That's all I'm asking." She turned away, muttering under her breath as she went back to unpacking the box, her irritation still palpable. But for now, the issue was settled, even if she wasn't happy about it. The day of the party arrived, and it was clear from the morning that things would be busy. My wife was running around, making final preparations, while I tried to keep out of the way. Everything seemed to be under control until I got an unexpected call from work. An emergency had come up, and I needed to head in immediately. Frustrated but without much choice, I grabbed my keys and told my wife I'd be back as soon as I could. Before leaving, I sent a message to the group chat with my friends. "Keep an eye on Lena's boyfriend tonight," I wrote. "You all know why." The responses came back quickly, all in agreement. "We've got it," one of them replied. That gave me some reassurance, but I still didn't feel great about leaving. At work, I managed to resolve the issue faster than expected. As I drove back, I started to feel a little more at ease. Maybe things would go smoothly after all. But just as I was pulling into our neighborhood, my phone buzzed with a new message from the chat. "Hey, has anyone seen your wife?" one of the guys asked. "She's not around." My heart sank. I quickly typed back, "What do you mean? Isn't she at the party?" The response came, "No one's seen her for a while." By the time I parked the car and stepped into the house, my nerves were on edge. The party was in full swing, with music blasting and people scattered throughout the rooms and backyard. I made my way through the crowd, scanning for my wife, but she was nowhere to be found. A few people nodded or greeted me, but I didn't stop to chat. Something felt off. I finally spotted Lena, standing by the kitchen with a drink in hand. She looked up as I approached, her expression neutral until I asked her directly, "Where's your boyfriend?" Her face shifted to confusion, and she shrugged. "I don't know. He was here earlier," she said. "Why?" I could tell from her tone that she didn't know any more than I did, but her lack of concern irritated me. "Because my wife is missing too," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. That got her attention. Her eyes widened, and she set her drink down. "She was here," Lena said quickly. "I saw her talking to some people not long ago." But there was an edge of uncertainty in her voice that made my stomach twist. Taking a step back, I glanced around the room again, hoping for some sign of her. Nothing. I turned back to Lena, who now looked as uneasy as I felt. "Let's go find them," I said. "I've got a bad feeling about this." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, setting her glass aside and following me as we started to search the house. The more rooms we checked, the worse the feeling grew. Upstairs, the hallway was quiet, a stark contrast to the noise downstairs. I pushed open one door after another, calling my wife's name, but all I found were empty rooms or guests who seemed surprised to see me. Lena stayed close, her unease growing more obvious with each step. Finally, I turned to her and said, "We'll need to check outside next." She nodded, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. "Maybe they're just out back," she offered, though her tone lacked conviction. We headed downstairs, weaving through the crowd, but I couldn't shake the heavy feeling in my chest. Something was definitely wrong. Out in the backyard, the cool night air offered little comfort as we searched every corner. The patio was empty except for a few stray partygoers, none of whom had seen my wife or Lena's boyfriend. I felt the frustration mounting as I scanned the shadows, hoping against hope for a sign of them. Lena stayed close, her concern now matching my own. "Maybe they went back inside," she suggested hesitantly. "Let's check upstairs again." Back inside, the noise of the party seemed louder than ever, a stark contrast to the growing tension I felt. We pushed through the crowd, ignoring the chatter and laughter as we made our way upstairs. The hallway was quiet, dimly lit, and empty, amplifying the unease settling in my gut. I paused, listening, and then I heard it, faint voices coming from one of the rooms at the end of the hall. I signaled to Lena, and we approached the door cautiously. As we got closer, the voices became clearer. One was panicked, almost pleading, while the other, a woman's voice, sounded frantic and desperate. My heart pounded as I recognized my wife's voice. "No, no, we can't call anyone," she was saying. "My husband will find out, and it'll ruin everything." Without hesitation, I pushed the door open, and what I saw froze me in place. My wife was lying on the bed, her face contorted in discomfort, while Lena's boyfriend hovered over her, fumbling with something. It didn't take long to realize what was happening. In his hands was an oversized toy, and the sheer absurdity of the situation didn't make it any less infuriating. The boyfriend looked up, his face pale as he stammered, "Man, listen, I can explain." But I wasn't interested in explanations. My fist connected with his face before he could get another word out, sending him sprawling to the floor. He scrambled to his feet, holding up his hands in a futile attempt to calm me down. "It's not what it looks like," he pleaded, but I wasn't hearing it. Lena stood frozen in the doorway, her face a mix of shock and horror. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded, but neither of us answered. I grabbed the guy by the collar, dragging him to his feet as he continued to babble incoherently. "Shut up," I growled, shoving him toward the door. "We're done talking." I pulled out my phone and sent a quick message to the group chat, "I need backup. Now." Within minutes, 2 of my closest friends were upstairs with us. They took one look at the situation and nodded in silent agreement. We weren't letting this guy walk away unscathed. Together, we restrained him, using whatever we could find to tie his hands securely. The boyfriend's protests grew louder as we dragged him downstairs and out to my car. "You're making a mistake," he shouted, but his words fell on deaf ears. Lena followed us, still trying to piece together what had happened, but I barely registered her presence. My focus was entirely on getting this guy as far away from my wife as possible. We drove out into the countryside, the tension in the car thick and unrelenting. The boyfriend's pleas for mercy continued, but none of us spoke. Finally, we reached a deserted stretch of road surrounded by dense forest. We hauled him out of the car and left him there, his hands still bound. Without another word, we got back in and drove off, leaving him to find his own way back. As we pulled back into the driveway, the flashing lights of an ambulance greeted me, bathing the house in a harsh, rhythmic glow. My heart sank at the sight, and I felt a surge of anger and dread. The party seemed to be winding down, with cars pulling out of the driveway and guests scattering, their laughter replaced by an awkward silence. Whatever had happened, it was clear that things had spiraled completely out of control. I parked the car and rushed inside, my focus entirely on finding my wife. The living room was a mess, littered with cups and empty bottles, but it was empty of people. The medics were in the hallway, speaking in low tones as they prepared to leave. And then I saw her, my wife, sitting on the couch, pale and visibly shaken, the oversized toy lying on the floor nearby like some grotesque reminder of everything that had gone wrong. The medics approached me as I entered the room, giving a quick explanation. "We've removed the object," one of them said matter-of-factly. "She's fine now, but she needs to take it easy for a while." I nodded, barely able to respond. They gathered their equipment and left, leaving me alone with her in the now eerily quiet house. I stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. My wife looked up at me, her eyes pleading, but I couldn't summon any sympathy. The events of the past few days came crashing down on me, and I felt a cold, unshakable resolve settle in. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but devoid of emotion. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "There's no point trying to explain," I said. "I've seen enough. All of this, is beyond repair. I'm filing for divorce." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Her face crumpled, and she shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please don't do this," she begged, her voice breaking. "It was a mistake, I know, but we can fix it. I'll do whatever it takes." I looked at her, feeling nothing but a hollow sense of finality. "It's too late," I said. "You've made your choices, and I've made mine. The papers will be ready soon. Just be prepared." Her desperation turned to anger, and she stood abruptly, pacing the room. "You're throwing everything away because of one stupid night," she demanded. "What about everything we've been through? Does that mean nothing to you?" I stayed calm, refusing to engage in the argument she was trying to start. "You made it mean nothing the moment you let this happen," I replied. She stared at me, her hands shaking with frustration, before storming off to the bedroom. I heard her throwing things into a bag, muttering angrily to herself. Moments later, she reappeared, her suitcase in tow. "Fine," she said bitterly. "I'll go to my mother's. Maybe she'll actually listen to me." I stepped aside as she stormed past, the sound of the suitcase wheels grating against the floor. The front door slammed shut behind her, leaving the house in silence once again. For the first time in days, I felt a strange sense of peace. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back now. In the days following the chaos of the party and my decision to end my marriage, I found myself restless, unable to shake the events that had unfolded. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became, not just at my wife but at Lena's boyfriend, the man who had instigated so much of the trouble. It wasn't enough that he had crossed boundaries and disrespected everyone involved, he had also managed to turn people's lives upside down. Something about the way he had manipulated Lena and the others gnawed at me. I decided to act. As an electrician, I had the skills and the knowledge to make a statement, one that he wouldn't forget. I called Lena under the pretense of needing to clarify some details about the party aftermath. During the conversation, I casually asked for the address of his store. She didn't think much of it, rattling off the location without hesitation. I thanked her and hung up, already planning my next move. That evening, I reached out to a couple of trusted friends who had been at the party and shared my frustrations. They were just as fed up with the guy as I was, especially after learning about his behavior and the chaos he had caused. Together, we devised a plan to visit the store after hours and send a clear message. The night was quiet as we pulled up to the shop. The storefront was modest, unassuming, but I couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction at the thought of what we were about to do. With tools in hand, we made our way to the electrical panel at the back of the building. It didn't take long to find the key points to tamper with. Years of experience in the field made the process almost too easy. We worked quickly, disabling circuits and creating subtle issues that wouldn't immediately raise suspicion but would escalate over time. The goal wasn't just to cause a minor inconvenience, we wanted him to feel the full weight of his actions. As we finished, I looked at the store one last time, knowing that its days were numbered. A few days later, the news broke. Lena's boyfriend's store had gone up in flames, a total loss. The fire had started due to an electrical fault, or so the report claimed. Hearing about it was both a relief and a grim reminder of the lengths I had gone to. While I didn't regret my actions, I couldn't ignore the weight of what we had done. The man had lost everything, and for the first time, I wondered if it was enough to finally make him reflect on his behavior. Not long after, I heard from Lena again. She called me, sounding more somber than usual. "I broke up with him," she said simply. "After everything that happened, I realized how toxic he was. He manipulated me into thinking his ideas about open relationships were normal. It was all about control for him." Her words didn't surprise me. From the beginning, it had been clear that he was a master manipulator, using charm and persuasion to get what he wanted. Lena's admission was just another confirmation of what I had suspected all along. "You did the right thing," I told her. "You deserve better than someone like that." She agreed, her voice steadier now. "I'm moving on. It's going to take time, but at least now I see things clearly." Her resolve was admirable, and it felt like a small victory amidst the chaos. The man who had caused so much harm was finally facing the consequences of his actions, both personally and professionally. With the store gone and his relationship over, he had nothing left. His influence, his control, it had all crumbled. And while I knew I couldn't change the past or undo the damage, I felt a sense of closure. Lena's decision to leave him was the final piece of the puzzle, proof that his manipulations had ultimately failed.